Hello, human geographers. We are back for our next lecture in the agriculture unit. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the different types of agriculture that predominate in less developed countries, countries that are part of the periphery and semi-periphery. Now, before we really get started, I do have one recommendation that I would advise you guys to follow. And that is to print out the climate and agricultural regions core map from the website. Have that side by side, because as we go through this, we're going to talk about the different types of agriculture. It would be helpful to see where in the world we're talking about. Now, obviously, we're going to list regions, but you might want to identify countries. That's a great thing to add to your notes. Examples of countries where we see these different types of agricultural practices predominating. All right. So if you haven't done that yet, press pause, go print it out, bring it back, have that side by side. Climate on one side, agricultural regions on another, as we're taking notes. So let's get started. We start out with subsistence agriculture. That's most of what we're going to be talking about tonight. But we start out with a specific type of subsistence agriculture, and that is extensive subsistence agriculture. And we have a definition. A form of agriculture characterized by low inputs of labor per unit land area. Two dominant systems are nomadic herding and shifting cultivations. Now, what we need to know about this is that when we're talking about extensive subsistence agriculture, it says low inputs of labor. What that means is that in order to get the maximum output, we don't have to necessarily put as much in. To be clear, what that means is that the output isn't tied to the input. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy. It just means that the output isn't tied to the input. The example that I always use is with nomadic herding and yak herding, because yak hair is actually something that is fairly profitable for nomadic herders, and so they will shear the yak and sell the hair. Now, the question that I always pose is, if you work a lot harder, does that yak grow its hair back faster? No. So that's what extensive is about, is that the input doesn't necessarily increase the output. Doesn't mean that it's easy. That's what we're talking about, all right? And so we're going to take a look at a couple different types of this. So let's start out with shifting cultivation. Shifting cultivation, by definition, is cultivation of crops in tropical forest clearings in which the forest vegetation has been removed by cutting and burning. These clearings are usually abandoned after a few years in favor of newly cleared forest land. Also known as, and this is an important alternative name you have to know, slash and burn agriculture. Now, in conjunction with nomadic herding, shifting cultivation occupies the largest percentage of the world's land area. So shifting cultivation plus nomadic herding equals the largest percentage of the world's land area, because you have to have a lot of land. As it says there, that it's only going to be used for a few years and then going to be abandoned. So you have to have new land. And that might really only be a year or two, as we're going to point out. And so make sure that you know the alternative name, slash and burn agriculture. We're going to talk about why that is the way that it is here in just a minute. There are some criticisms that go along with shifting cultivation, and these criticisms apply to nomadic herding as well. And so let's take a look at those. Upsetting ecology, a good example of that is desertification, the expansion of desert-like conditions. Whether that is for nomadic herding with overgrazing, or the use, or we should say abuse, of the soil when it comes to shifting cultivation, can lead to the expansion of desert-like conditions. Obviously, when you're cutting down trees, that is destroying natural resources. And shifting cultivation has a lot of competition with logging and mining companies for access to land, as we're going to see here in just a minute. It uses a lot of land and produces relatively little food. That is fairly characteristic of all extensive subsistence agriculture. But in addition to that, we've also seen that um, shifting cultivation has been challenged by population pressure. As populations continue to grow, it's a problem that it doesn't produce very much. And so that is a big issue for areas that practice shifting cultivation, and choices have to be made. The soil shows negative impacts for years after, mainly because shifting cultivation is practiced in tropical areas. Um, Tropical soil tends to be very nutrient poor because the nutrients are tied up in the actual vegetation itself. So by slashing and burning, you're releasing a lot of nutrients. However, those nutrients in the soil don't remain for very long. And so the land doesn't remain productive for very long. As we mentioned, we see the impact of natural resources, and this is a really famous case in Brazil. Brazil is notorious for deforestation, and you can visually see this. This is an example of remote sensing. We can see just the change in a short period of time, 7 years, the impact of deforestation as a result of not just shifting cultivation, to be clear, but also because of the expansion of urban areas, perhaps, also logging, mining, things like that, things that we mentioned on the last slide. So again, with slash and burn agriculture, we typically see this in, and this is where that climate map is going to come in, humid, low latitude climates, particularly areas like South America, especially in South America, Latin America, Central and South. Um, we also see it in Sub-Saharan Africa as well as in Southeast Asia. And so the practice kind of goes like this. There's several steps that typically are practiced here. First is that they will come in and cut down the foliage, but the foliage you have to allow it to dry out in order to get the best burn. And so they'll allow it to just sit and dry out for a period of time, and then we'll come in and conduct the burn. And that clears the land, but also releases the nutrients into the soil. And then the seeds are planted directly into the ashes. And so, an area where this has taken place is called a swidden, a path of land cleared by foreplanting through slashing and burning. So just make sure that you know the vocabulary term of swidden is associated with slash and burn agriculture. And obviously, this is not sustainable because it takes a long time for the plants and the vegetation to grow back. Sometimes there are some resources that say that it might be 20 years before farmers return to an area to do this again. And they really only can last a year, maybe two, a little bit longer than that, but nowhere near the amount of time that it takes for crops to actually grow back. The next type of extensive subsistence agriculture that we need to talk about is pastoral nomadism. I almost always call it nomadic pastoralism, so just be aware. Essentially what it is nomadic herding. So you'll see terms used slightly interchangeably, so just be aware of that. So nomadic pastoralism or pastoral nomadism is a form of subsistence agriculture based on herding domesticated animals that are solely dependent on natural forage. And so we typically see this in dry climates where most other agriculture is not viable. And so we see it in arid as well as in semi-arid climates, areas like North Africa, the Middle East, North and West China. Central Asia is another area where we see a lot of nomadic herding. So there's several areas that we see there. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions associated with nomadic pastoralism is that the nomads are eating the animals. But the problem is, if you eat the animals, then there's nothing to use for the future. So typically, what happens is that they will use animal products, especially things like whether it is fur or hair that they shear off the animals, or milk that they milk from the animals, and trade that for food or sell that for food. Typically, the food is grain, so just kind of be aware of it. Animal products in exchange for grain is largely what we see with nomadic pastoralism. And there's really only certain animals that we typically see this with, sheep, goats, llamas in the Americas, camels, yaks. So there's certain animals that we typically see. We don't see a lot of cattle, for example. That's more associated with livestock ranching. So you have to be aware of those subtle nuances that we see that differentiate nomadic pastoralism and livestock ranching. One vocabulary term that we have to be aware of with regards to nomadic pastoralism is transhumance. And we introduced this in our migration unit, but we reintroduce it now. And that is the seasonal migration of pastoralists and their livestock between highland and lowland pastures, typically following the pattern of rainfall and fields to graze in. And so that's the practice known as transhumance. And for nomadic pastoralists, there's some issues that tend to be more prominent for them. There's a lot of competition for resources, especially if nomadic pastoralists, if there aren't many resources, if there aren't a lot of fields to graze in, you have a lot of people with their herds, that can lead to a lot of competition. Because they cover huge geographic areas, they might be crossing international borders often, doesn't produce a lot for the nomadic pastoralists, so there's not a lot of economic gain from this. And because of growing populations, it doesn't produce very much either. And obviously, we mentioned this earlier with regards to upsetting ecology. Overgrazing is a major issue for nomadic pastoralists. Now, switching gears for a little bit, we talked about extensive. Now let's introduce intensive subsistence agriculture. By definition, a form of subsistence agriculture in which farmers must expend a relatively large amount of effort to produce the maximum feasible yield from a parcel of land. And a good example is consumption rice, or rice that is consumed. As with extensive we said that the output is not directly tied to the input. In the case of intensive, the output is directly tied to the input. The more you input, the more feasibly you could get for the output. And that if you're not putting much in, you're not going to get much out. All right? So we have to be aware of that. We tend to see this in various climates, but especially areas of South Asia, East Asia should add their Southeast Asia as well. And this engages the largest percentage of the world's people. Extensive engages the largest land area. Intensive engages the largest percentage of people, employs the most people. All right. And it kind of makes sense, because when we look at the areas where it's being practiced or widely practiced, they tend to be in the most densely populated areas. With intensive subsistence agriculture, the parcels that they're using tend to be very, very small with very, very little machinery. So it requires a lot of people. And virtually no land is wasted. And what this gives way to is, or has given way to, as we'll talk about in a later lecture, but I'll introduce it very briefly here, is the concept of terracing. Terracing is the modification of the landscape, essentially hillsides, carving basically like steps into a hillside, in order to create more land for cultivation. All right. In the past, when you have a hillside, you can't really grow stuff on a hillside because it doesn't stay in place. And so terracing is a way that would make this more viable. All right. So just an introduction here. We're going to talk about this a lot more later. But this is something that is characteristic of intensive subsistence agriculture. And a person that we need to know with regards to this is goes by the name of Esther Boserup. And Esther Boserup was a geographer, and her case, we have a definition here. The view that population growth independently forces a conversion from extensive to intensive subsistence agriculture. So essentially what Esther Boserup did is she argued against Thomas Malthus. Malthus said, "Oh no, population is growing too fast. We're all going to die." Boserup said, "Not so fast. It's okay. Take a chill pill. We'll make some changes." All right. In the past, we've done things extensively. Right? This is using large areas of land. It's not producing very much. Instead, we'll make a switch. We'll use smaller parcels of land. We'll use it intensively. We'll make sure that we work hard to produce the maximum possible yield, and we'll be just fine. And that's Esther Boserup's theory in essentially a nutshell. All right? And that's what you have to make sure that you understand. And this goes all the way back to Unit 2. Malthus, as England was moving into stage 2 of the demographic transition model, said population is going to exceed food production. And his critics said, no, we'll make adjustments. Esther Boserup was one of those critics. And she just said that as population pressure increases, we're going to make some switches. And if you notice the past couple slides when we talked about shifting cultivation / modern agriculture and nomadic pastoralism, we said that two of the biggest challenges for people engaging in that type of agriculture is that population pressure is it doesn't produce enough. So there's too much pressure being put on those agriculturalists to produce. They're not going to be able to do it. They're going to have to make a switch. And what Esther Boserup said is they're going to switch from extensive to intensive. And that's going to lead to more production per unit of land. And so that's an important note to make. So let's take a look at some of the different types of intensive subsistence agriculture. The two biggest types that we have here are intensive wet rice and what our textbook calls non-wet rice, or not dominant wet rice, non-dominant areas. All right. So essentially, what this is because the climate can be in a lot of different areas, we see two different types. Intensive wet rice tends to be in areas where you get a lot higher precipitation, higher humidity. So these tend to be areas near the tropics or that have a high level of precipitation, coastal areas, things like that. And so where wet rice is dominant, and essentially what that is just rice, is there's a series of steps that take place. All right. And so what typically happens is that the seedling is grown in a nursery, a greenhouse, something like that, and then it is transplanted later. All right. The field might be plowed by animals, yaks, water buffalo especially. They're plowed, and then they go in and they transplant the seedlings when they're ready from the nursery to the water. And the water helps to maintain the temperature in order for the seedling to grow up and produce rice. All right. And so the field is then flooded, but it's a controlled flood. All right. It's not just a deluge of water. It's a controlled flood, again, in order to maintain the temperature. Too hot, too cold, that can be damaging for the rice. That's why it's intensive. And that flooded field is known as a sawa. And so what we start to see more and more of, as is because this is intensive, we started to see more double cropping, the harvesting twice a year from the same field. Right? Now, we mentioned crop rotation before. This is very similar, all right, that you're just using the same field twice in 1 year. All right. Now, on the flip side of that, in areas where wet rice isn't dominant, where rice isn't typically grown, climate is the biggest explanation as to why. All right. Typically, the areas where wet rice is not going to be viable is areas where precipitation levels, rainfall is too low, and the winters are too harsh, too cold. All right. And so areas that we might see that, northern China is a great example, and the interior part of India. They don't grow as much wet rice. Wet rice in India is typically grown on the coastal areas, and in the interior, it's not wet rice. Instead, it's wheat. All right, other forms of grains like barley, corn, things like that. All right, where the climate is not conducive to that. So let's take a look at an example of this. This is just one visual of a rice field in Indonesia. And it was really interesting. When I traveled to Korea, there are rice fields everywhere. Like we'd be driving down the highway from Seoul, and we just see like rice fields dotted in between places. Wherever there was a spot of land that was available, that was open, there was a rice field. It was really, really fascinating to see that. They looked just like this. It was just a field of water, and you could see the very meticulous rows of rice planted there. It was really fascinating. Now, the last thing that we have to mention for tonight is not subsistence. So make sure that you know that point. Everything tonight thus far has been subsistence. People growing for consumption. They're growing so that they can eat. This slide is not that. It's commercial. This is for profit. But this is a form of commercial agriculture that we typically see in countries of the periphery and semi-periphery, LDCs, less developed countries, and that is plantation agriculture. A plantation is a large farm in tropical and subtropical climates that specializes in the production of one or two crops for sale, usually to a more developed country. So obviously the climate is going to be warm and humid. And this is something that we typically see in LDCs. So as far as commercial agriculture goes, we've seen the expansion of commercial agricultures in LDCs, mainly because MDCs are pushing for it. MDCs want certain commodities, certain crops that they aren't able to grow. Notice the climate that's associated here. These are tropical and subtropical areas. And if you're an MDC that's not tropical or subtropical, well, then how are you going to get your coffee? And so what we've started to see more and more of is LDCs beginning to specialize in one or two crops that they grow purely with the intention of selling it to MDCs, selling it to the core to make the most amount of money because of the demand. MDCs demand those crops. They're willing to pay for it. That makes a lot of money for LDCs. And so areas that we see it, Central and South America, Africa, Asia, again, really all periphery and semi-periphery states in one way, shape, or form. As the definition suggested, it really focuses on one or two crops. There's something that they specialize in. They are very efficient in what they do, and that's in order to make a profit. It's commercial. And so they're going to specialize in one or two crops, and this is a vocabulary term that we can introduce called monoculture, dependence on a single agricultural commodity. So we'll give you some examples. In Latin America, we see a lot of coffee, sugarcane, bananas as the plantation crops from those areas. And this will allow us to introduce a later vocabulary term called luxury crops, is that they focus on crops that are a luxury that MDCs are willing to pay for. All right, coffee is a great example of that. In Asia, we see a lot of rubber tree plantations, and rubber trees are often used for things like latex gloves, as well as palm oil. And palm oil is used in a variety of different products, ranging from things like detergent and shampoo to things like ice cream. And so they're going to specialize in certain types of crops that are typically consumed in MDCs. And this is a form of commercial agriculture that brings in a lot of money for these LDCs. Now, in our next lecture, we're going to look at other forms of commercial agriculture that are characteristic of MDCs, of the core. So I'll see you guys next time. Have a wonderful evening.